The International Monetary Fund functions as the primary diagnostic body for the global economy. Their baseline projections dictate how central banks and institutional investors calibrate their risk management. This modeling shows a sharp contraction in productivity. Global GDP growth stalls at 2%, a level that historically signals the threshold of a worldwide recession. At the same time, the forecast for inflation pushes to 6%, directly intersecting with the falling growth rate. Economists define this specific mathematical intersection, where production slows while prices explode, as a negative supply shock. This structural crisis originates from a localized geopolitical event, bypassing the routine cycles of consumer demand or market fluctuations. On February 28, 2026, the outbreak of war between the United States, Israel, and Iran immediately destroyed significant industrial infrastructure. Tehran adopted an asymmetric strategy to counter Western military strength. By pushing the conflict outward to maritime choke points, they avoided direct kinetic competition in favor of economic disruption. The United States mobilized a conventional response on a massive scale. The Pentagon recently requested an additional $200 billion to maintain its presence in the region. This level of military expenditure has failed to mitigate the economic fallout. Despite maintaining kinetic superiority, the West remains vulnerable to the compounding damage in the energy and commercial integrity has emerged as the war's primary center of gravity, proving more critical to the outcome than controlling physical territory. The physical fulcrum is the Strait of Hormuz, the only exit for Persian Gulf energy exports. Shipping data shows 25% of global seaborne oil. Iranian forces effectively closed the route using sea mines and the seizure of merchant vessels, including 2 container ships taken in late April. This triggered a dual blockade. The U.S. Navy blocked Iranian ports, while the Iranian military maintained its hold over the strait, trapping Allied tankers. This standoff stranded 20,000 mariners. Naval interventions, such as those by the USS Bainbridge, became necessary as standard commercial operations ceased. Consequently, tanker traffic through the strait dropped essentially to zero. By paralyzing this single geographic node, a regional actor effectively removed a fifth of the world's energy and raw material supply from the market. The loss of these materials transitions the crisis from energy markets into a broader manufacturing paralysis. The acute shortage of natural gas, a key feedstock, has aggressively halted the production of critical nitrogen fertilizers worldwide. Simultaneously, the energy crisis forced aluminum smelters to implement mandatory capacity cuts, preserving local power grids. Critical helium production has also stalled, creating immediate bottlenecks in the advanced manufacturing and semiconductor sectors. These rising costs are captured by the Producer Price Index, or PPI, tracking wholesale prices for components. Driven by material shortages, this wholesale inflation hit a 3-month high, with a 4% jump. The localized physical bottleneck in the strait has successfully translated into systemic wholesale inflation. Wholesale costs function as a leading indicator for retail prices, moving through the economy on a distinct time delay. We can model this transmission mechanism as a 2-piston engine. When the first piston, the wholesale index, spikes, the force eventually transfers to the second piston, the consumer price index. Global food prices have already reached record highs, as the fertilizer shortage impacts the start of the primary planting season. Skyrocketing jet fuel prices have forced airlines to raise fares, a factor that contributed to the total collapse of Spirit Airlines. As these costs hit households, consumer sentiment has reached record lows, reflecting a widespread cautiousness in discretionary spending. The IMF's 6% inflation forecast tracks the mathematical progression of these cost increases, moving from raw extraction through industrial processing to the consumer. This sequence creates a severe dilemma for the Federal Reserve and other global central banks. Central banks operate under a dual mandate, maintaining price stability while supporting growth. Usually, when inflation rises, banks increase interest rates, cooling the economy to lower prices. But current inflation is driven by physical shortages rather than high demand. An aggressive interest rate hike now destroys fragile growth, risking economic collapse without solving the supply problem. If they instead cut rates to stimulate growth, they risk flooding the market with capital, pushing inflation well beyond the 6% threshold. Facing these two catastrophic outcomes, the IMF has advised central banks to simply wait and watch. A geopolitical shock to the supply side creates a stagflation trap that neutralizes the influence of the world's most powerful financial institutions. These factors confirm the IMF's terminal worst-case scenario. Current market instability stems directly from a failure of geographic security, overriding the safeguards of the global banking system. When we trace the data backward from the consumer through the wholesale index, the path returns to the same nautical bottleneck. Asymmetric warfare allowed a regional power to bypass conventional military might and impose a structural defeat on global energy and commodity markets. The global economic model remains inherently fragile as long as its critical resources are funneled through singular, vulnerable geographic points. This vulnerability poses a direct challenge to U.S. hegemony. The conflict has demonstrated that military superiority cannot prevent the weaponization of the supply chain. Economic disruptions will persist long after a ceasefire. The backlog of idle tankers and damaged energy infrastructure will take years to normalize. Other global actors are analyzing this conflict, identifying how to use their own geography to achieve similar strategic leverage over global trade. We have entered a period where the domestic monetary policy of Western nations is effectively dictated by regional conflicts thousands of miles away. The 2026 conflict demonstrated a new strategic reality. Localized control over physical maritime gates can effectively neutralize the economic autonomy of a global superpower.